Okay, everyone. We'll get started with our talk with some great folks today. I'm Waleed. I'm the communications director at Justice Democrats. Today we're having a panel with Daniel Aldana Cohen, Rihanna Gunright, and Jamal Bowman about the stimulus, about inequality and how it intersects with issues of environmental racism and climate change, and how we got to where we are today and what kind of response we need going forward. So people are trickling in. We've got people on Facebook and Twitter and YouTube following the Justice Democrats and Jamal Bowman pages. If you're tuning in, you can definitely, if you've already heard about Jamal Bowman, you can go to Bowman for, and if you haven't, you can go to bowmanforcongress.com to sign up for updates, to donate, to sign up to phone bank and volunteer. All that stuff is there at bowmanforcongress.com. But we'll get started now. So Rihanna and Daniel, you can come off your video, or you can come on the video. So we are joined by Rihanna Gunright, who is the climate policy director at Roosevelt. Am I getting that right? The title?
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
There we go. And then we have Daniel Aldana Cohen, who is a sociology professor at the University of Pennsylvania in Philly. Both Daniel and Rihanna have been major figures in the policy world for the Green New Deal, and have been really putting out the ideas that will, help us through this recovery and meet the scale of what people need. And we're also joined by Jamal Bowman, who is a Bronx middle school principal and is running for Congress in New York's 16th district, which includes the Bronx and Westchester. And he is running against a 31-year incumbent, Elliot Engel. Some of you might have heard on Twitter or Facebook today that Elliot Engel was in the news. And Jamal, I just wanted to turn it to you to start off and share what happened in the news today.
Yeah, so Elliot Engel, I guess about a week ago, tweeted or reported that he was going to be in the district in the Bronx and Mount Vernon, specifically handing out food, handing out masks, and really serving and supporting his community. Come to find out that was not the case. While he was supposed to be in the Bronx and in Mount Vernon, he was actually at his home in Maryland. And when a reporter approached him to question him about why he wasn't in the Bronx, he tried to say that he was there initially, and then it came to find out that he wasn't there. So not only has he not been present in the district from the very beginning of this pandemic, when he was supposed to be present, he actually lied about it and didn't tell the truth. But it's no different from what we've heard throughout this campaign. From the very beginning, we've been hearing that Congressman Engel is absent. He is not present. He is not engaged. And it's time for a change. And up until 2013, he claimed his home in Maryland as his primary residence. So it's obviously unacceptable on so many levels. We need people right here who are going to show up, who are going to be present, who are going to fight for the people throughout this district. And unfortunately, Elliot Engel hasn't done that prior to the pandemic, and he's not doing it now.
Thanks, Jamal, for the update. So we are going to turn to the topic at hand, which is how does the climate crisis and environmental racism impact how the pandemic is hitting communities differently? So I'm going to turn to Rihanna, maybe you first, and then Daniel, you can chime in. Just, all the ways that the things that are already happening in our economy and our democracy and our society are impacting how people are experiencing the pandemic today.
For sure. And before I start, apologies for being in my bathroom. It's quarantine and I live in an apartment and I have a husband. So a lot of what we're seeing, right? It's been all over the news that fatality and hospitalization rates from COVID-19 are higher for Black people. Basically, all across the country, basically anywhere that you're seeing COVID, you're seeing higher mortality rates for Black folks, and to a somewhat lesser extent Latinx folks, and definitely Native folks as well. And there's been a lot of talk about sort of background health conditions, but the fact is a lot of the background health conditions that make people more at risk for severe complications from COVID-19 are directly related to toxic air pollution and toxic pollution of all kinds. And actually, when you are looking at the places that are hubs for Corona, what you're seeing is even when you look there, the hot spots are frontline communities. So they're basically, you can kind of lay the maps on top of one another and predict very closely what areas are going to have higher mortality rates from this. And that all has to do with things that were in place before COVID-19. There's been a long history of oil and gas and just industries that that release a ton of toxic air pollution. They are systemically cited in low-income Black and Brown communities on purpose. There are places where essentially it's okay to poison people, right? People put the factories, they put the coal-fired power plants, they put all those things in places where folks have less power. So when they make noise about getting cancer, like in Cancer Alley, or they make noise about, you know, neighbors dropping dead left and right in Detroit from pollution from Marathon and trucks and all sorts of things. All of that was happening before. And then on top of that, what we're seeing is that the economic effects of COVID-19 are also more pronounced in Black and Brown communities, which is again because of structural issues in terms of occupational segregation. People of color are more likely to work low-wage jobs in service industries. Those are also the jobs that are most likely to have been impacted by COVID-19 shutdowns. And then on top of that, even the sort of Paycheck Protection Program, the main program for small businesses, the way that it was designed so haphazardly that it actually is incredibly difficult for business owners of color to access those loans, up to something like they expect 90% of Black businesses won't be able to access them because they go through banks. There's all these other sorts of things. And so on every level of the COVID-19 crisis, you are seeing Black and Brown people disproportionately affected. And that's all because of the ways that we have built the system up till now.
Yeah, I mean, thanks. That's totally right, of course. And I don't have a ton to add to that. I think if we sort of like step back, a thing that social scientists say all the time is that there's no such thing as a natural disaster, because the things that create vulnerability are unnatural, which is like inequalities of race and class and gender, and that are really patterned. As Rihanna was saying, at Penn, a group of us were putting together some maps just to basically show what Rihanna's already said, which is that if you go and look at the places that have the highest concentrations of essential workers, like working class people, that are the most racialized, that are most exposed to air pollution, you will also find the highest rates likely of COVID infection and death. The same actually is true for climate change. And I think that's another thing we have to really hammer home. The vulnerability to climate change is exacerbated by institutional racism, by class inequality, by gender inequality. So if we think, I think in ways that some people don't always think about, like vulnerability to extreme heat. We're doing some research in Philly showing there are neighborhoods that were redlined with no trees that are now gentrified, and folks there can afford their electricity. But there are neighborhoods in Philly, which is where I live, where people are paying 20% of their income just in electricity costs. And the number of extreme heat days is going to multiply, it's going to go up by 10. And I think about the summer, a third of families in the country can't afford their utility bills. That's heavily racialized as well. The number one reason people take out payday loans is to pay their utility bills. And we're looking at a summer where people are going to be trapped inside and they're going to be facing probably record-breaking heat, and their electricity bills are going to be going through the roof. And so it's not necessarily the case that every low-income family is going to get hit by a hurricane, but the everyday experience of climate change, just simply extreme heat, just to give one example, again, has everything to do with race and class. And of course, women who run these households most often are bearing the brunt of these burdens. So yeah, I think just to basically echo what Rihanna was saying, this is a horrible virus, but what is really making people vulnerable are patterns of institutionalized racism, class inequality, exactly the kinds of things that Jamal, I feel like your campaign is really all about taking on.
Yeah, and as an educator for 20 years, we looked at, and I looked at education through a racialized lens. And I was always very clear that concentrated poverty, underfunded schools, lack of resources, high class sizes were all racialized. They were all disproportionate in Black and Brown communities. And it's important to have this racialized lens and this class-based lens as an elected official. You have to be able to view policy through that lens as well. And what I would add to what was already said is the lack of response and the lack of urgent response in this district in particular from the elected officials here at the city and state level, and obviously Donald Trump and his horrible response. The first case of COVID-19 in this district was in New Rochelle. It was in a wealthy white neighborhood. And the response was urgent and the response was swift. We contained an area, we closed the schools, we brought in a testing site, we brought in the National Guard to help distribute food, and we responded very urgently. As we know, and when you look at things through a racialized lens, you know that Yonkers, Mount Vernon, other parts of New Rochelle, and the North Bronx in particular, are going to be communities that are more vulnerable. And when you have a racialized lens, you can prepare for that, right? So Yonkers since then has taken over as the highest number of COVID cases in the county. Out of 43 municipalities, Yonkers has clearly the most cases, followed by Mount Vernon, and the North Bronx is right there. But there was not the same urgent response in Yonkers, in Mount Vernon, in parts of New Rochelle, and in the North Bronx. And it's not just the historical institutional racism and institutional classism that exists, it's the lack of clarity around how history impacts our present and how we need to respond in the present that's making it so severe in Black and Brown communities.
Yeah, and I'll add on to that. I think it's really important, like Jamal said, for elected officials to have a racial and class lens on policy, because like Daniel said, because these things are created, right? They're not just naturally occurring. It also means that the way to get rid of them is largely through policy as well. So if you don't have a racial or a class lens on policy, it's not just that you can't accurately diagnose the problem, you also can't create an effective solution.
And connected to that, what are some of the short-term and long-term policy prescriptions that you see as playing out as delivering actual relief to people right now? Anyone can take that one.
Yeah, $1,200 a month is not enough. Not in this district, not in anywhere in the country. We have the highest number of WIC recipients in this congressional district in the entire country. We have 40,000 people who are severely rent burdened, which means they pay more than 50% of their salary toward rent. We have 4 NYCHA developments. We have almost 2,000 homeless in Westchester County. $1,200 is not enough. We've called for monthly payments of $2,000 to working families, immigrant communities included in that as well, documented and undocumented. We've also called for the cancellation of rent, the cancellation of mom and pop mortgages, and the cancellation of utilities, to Daniel's point. This is a moment where the federal government and all of its resources needs to step in and take care of the American people until we're out of the woods with this pandemic. Our response was late because we didn't listen to the science. It wasn't urgent in our most vulnerable communities. And the response then needed to be very aggressive. We still don't have enough testing. We still don't have contact tracing. People are still fighting for PPEs. So those are some of the immediate things that need to happen right now. And unfortunately, Donald Trump is at the wheel, so it's going to be very hard to get those things, but that's what we're fighting for.
Yeah, I would add on to that at the federal level, there, in addition to moratoriums on rent or mortgage, a policy that could really help is moratorium on utility shutoffs. Because like Daniel said, during the summer, people are going to face record heat waves. As we know, with kids having to be homeschooled, broadband is more crucial than ever. And we still treat broadband as a service when really it's a utility in the 21st century. And it should be treated like a public good. And then on top of that, there is already a federal program called LIHEAP. That's the acronym, but essentially it's a low income utility assistance program. So it helps pay utility bills for low income families. It's a great program. It's underfunded. It doesn't reach everyone it could reach right now. And the need is more than it's ever been. So more, about at least 5 times more funding for LIHEAP, if not more. And then also, I think it's important, obviously the first thing that we have to focus on right now is how do we support and protect people through this pandemic. But we also have to recognize that these are huge, in terms of, these are huge economic policies that are being passed. We have never moved this much money in stimulus before in the CARES Act, and we're going to need way more. And what that means is that the decisions around stimulus, even though we're very much thinking in the short term, will have long-term effects. And so we also have to be thinking about, in particular, when it comes to climate, are we making decisions in the short term that are going to lock in industry, say oil and gas, for a far longer time than we actually want them in play? And so another thing that's really important on the federal level is targeted support for renewables. Renewable and clean energy employs a ton of people, and they're looking to lose about 500,000 people, jobs within by the end of the year. And there's no targeted support for clean energy. But of course, we've seen in the news oil and gas execs meeting with Donald Trump, all of these efforts to sort of, even if they're not included in the CARES Act, to back channel resources to oil and gas. And so we just have to think also long term, how are we setting ourselves up for a more just economy and also a more green economy? Because we don't want to come out of this crisis to face the climate crisis and we've fallen behind where we are right now, which is already too far behind.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I couldn't agree more. And strongly recommend. Rihanna wrote a fantastic op-ed in the New York Times making the case for the green stimulus right now. And I want to circle back again. I'm so obsessed with utilities these days. But I think there are these ways that we don't talk enough about how it's really strategic to start, like counterintuitively maybe, green stimulus investments right now. And let me just give you some examples. So one thing we could do, Obama administration had a pretty successful program, is cash for appliances. Like even in this context with COVID, you could be paying folks to turn in their old air conditioners, which are super inefficient, having them recycled to avoid putting toxins into the air, which cause climate change, and replaced with much more efficient new air conditioners, which would save people money this summer. And that's work that can be done with things like curbside pickup. Like we know how to run a cash for appliances trade-in program. That's already been done. That could save families literally hundreds of dollars a year. We could also do things like home energy retrofits, this like structural long-term change. In 2009, it took 6 months just to sort out the paperwork of how much to pay workers in each location before the work could start getting done on low-income housing retrofits called the Weatherization Assistance Program. Well, Washington has a lot of people who are working at home on their computers. They could start that work right now so that the minute it is safe for contractors to go into folks' homes, they can do that. Maybe that's October, maybe that's November, we don't know. But we can start that work right away. And that also means then that the community agencies that are going to do these retrofits can be hiring people in the communities where this work is going to get done. A lot of them probably in your district, Jamal. That hiring can be made, workers can have some certainty, contracts can go out, small businesses, worker-owned businesses, cooperatives can know that they've got work coming to them. Things like schools, you can be doing school retrofits right now. There are some schools around the country that are getting these like deep energy retrofits, so that finally in public schools all over the country, in every zip code, you would know that you have a safe temperature, healthy temperature 365 days a year. So there's some lead remediation happening, for instance, in Philly, but you have a few school districts where they're also doing those deeper energy retrofits. That's jobs in those communities. And I guess I think that we have to focus on all the short-term immediate relief that you talked about, canceling rent, shutoffs, and all that. But the core underlying principle of the Green New Deal, which is like disproportionate investment in frontline communities so that working people and Black and brown people and Indigenous folks can themselves build the Green New Deal, we actually don't have to wait 1 year for that. We can start that right now. We can get the paperwork going, we can get the money flowing, and even literally things like swapping out window AC units can be happening right now that will make like a real difference. You know, it could keep a family at a safe temperature instead of having like a health and like basically group psychology crisis in the heat just 3 or 4 months from now, or 2 months from now, 1 month from now.
Yeah, and I think people sometimes think of those things like, how are they connected to this pandemic right now? But in a lot of ways, climate policy is economic policy. So the things that you're hearing Daniel talk about, low income or retrofitting homes in low income communities so that they're more energy efficient, that saves people a lot of money on energy. And low income homes have far higher sort of utility burdens than sort of the average home. So most people think of their utilities as a small cost, but it can be as much as 30% of a household budget if you're a low income family. And also in different places, I used to work in Detroit, people who are low income or in an urban area that, you know, has a lower median income, they might be paying more for utilities than people in well-off communities, right? In Detroit, people paid far more for water and trash pickup in Detroit than they did in a suburb where the median income was 2-3 times what it was in Detroit. And so I think folks have to realize it's also not just that folks have less money. These things could literally just cost more in their communities. And that makes a big difference. Shaving off, you know, hundreds of dollars a year, if not thousands, makes a big difference. And then the other part of what you can do right now too, to both get people employed, get more money in people's pockets from energy savings, and also walk us closer to decarbonization, is expanding the weatherization assistance program to do things like install solar panels, right, on people's homes, to do solar installations. There are things like that that aren't currently covered under the program, that there's no reason that they shouldn't be, and particularly if they're goods where people couldn't afford the cost to install it anyway, because it's an upfront cost. So why don't we just include that in work that we're already doing so we don't have to go back and do it later, or force people to end up taking out loans that they ultimately can't afford for this new technology just to save themselves money and just to provide their families with, you know, safer, cleaner energy.
Yeah. I'm wondering what you all think about what the Democratic response has been so far, or first what the main response has been through the packages, and then with the packages that were just announced this week. You know, some have said that this is a messaging bill. Some have said, if it's a messaging bill, why does it include bad stuff? And yeah, like what does the response look like right now from Congress, from the government, and what do you think it should look like, and what should progressives, Democrats be doing to prepare for, you know, what basically Joe Biden spent the entire year campaigning on a return to normalcy, and these are the most abnormal times. And yeah, what do you think should be done to start preparing the Joe Biden and holding him accountable to, you know, a Green New Deal?
Can I just want to say what I don't hear or see is conversations like this happening within the Democratic Party, like what Rihanna and Daniel are talking about. I don't hear these conversations anywhere. You know, what I hear at most is, you know, climate change as a catchphrase, or environmental justice as a catchphrase, or even the Green New Deal as a catchphrase. But the specifics that they're referring to, not just with utilities, but in terms of like, people need jobs. Like before the pandemic, we had, you know, millions who were unemployed, underemployed. People need jobs. And this is an opportunity for us to shift the conversation, but then shift resources and truly invest where they are needed so that we can put people to work. You know, there are parts of this district, pockets of this district, where poverty rates are as high as 30%. And there's no real energy or mobilization around putting people to work in the green economy that we are trying to build. You know, I've always seen the Green New Deal as the industrial revolution of the 21st century, ending our dependency on fossil fuels, getting to net zero carbon emissions in the next 10 years. People are ready to work, and they want to work, and they want to earn family sustaining wages, and they want to be in the union. They want to be a part of building the American fabric. But our government hasn't done enough to generate the revenue to invest in these spaces, or like they did with Wall Street. You know, they just they wrote a check for $1.5 trillion when Wall Street started suffering, gave it to Wall Street and just bailed them out. That same investment can happen with green technology in this district. So I don't hear the Democratic Party at all having these conversations, and I don't hear Elliot Engel at all having these conversations, especially in places like the Bronx, where you're 3 times more likely to die of asthma than anywhere else in the country, where you have Co-op City surrounded by the Hutchinson River Parkway and the Cross Bronx Expressway on either side. And it has a power plant burning fossil fuel right there in Co-op City, creating some of the highest asthma rates in the country. I personally don't see that conversation happening at all at this level, this granular level that I think is important.
Yeah, and I think,
Yeah.
oh, sorry, go ahead, Rihanna.
Oh, I was gonna say, so this is a good time to make it clear I am talking in my personal capacity. This does not represent the views of the organization that I work for. But I think the Dem response, it's been good on certain things. The expansion of unemployment was great and necessary. Right. There's been, there have been good things, but overall, it's lacking. It still feels a bit like the bills are written for 2010 instead of 2020. And there's still a lot of focus on deficit, on how much things cost, which of course is not to say deficits never matter, right? But when you're looking at what we're looking at, which is a very, very possibly an economic crash worse than the Great Depression, unprecedented levels of unemployment. The last thing that actually matters is the deficit right now, especially because it's cheaper than ever to borrow money. The priorities just aren't quite clear. And I don't think that the bills reflect the need for structural change in the ways that are important. I think it still sort of represents a fallacy that sort of we can both empower people while also leaving Wall Street and the wealthiest to do whatever it is that they want, or to leave them with as much power as they have now. And I think what this crisis has shown in the response is that that's not the case. Right? We don't have billionaires, funding a bunch of stuff. We don't have them giving a ton of money. We don't have them sort of doing the things that were implicit in the promise of, if you let people get as rich as possible, they'll pass it down. It will all go around. When hard times come,
Trickle down economics.
They're going to have the back of working people. We're not seeing that, right? We're seeing companies take money and not agree to keep on their staff, right? We're seeing companies take bailouts and not agree not to buy back stock necessarily, right? We're seeing all sorts of things that just remind us that the market has a place, but the market is not a moral compass or emergency assistance. You're not.
If I could, absolutely, absolutely. And I mean, I would say like first as a, again, of course, speaking in my personal capacity here, but the message I take from the Democrats' messaging bill is like, you should go to bowmanforcongress.com and donate because it's in a lot of ways ridiculous. I mean, like I think you're exactly right about the 21st century, and not just that, but we come from a legacy of massive economic inequality and institutional racism. And at best, the Pelosi bill and what the Democrats are proposing are restoring us to a decent time in the late 20th century economy. We don't live in the 20th century anymore. Let me just give a couple numbers from a piece that I wrote in The Guardian with Dan Kamen, who's a terrific IPCC scientist and energy scholar out of Berkeley. A World Bank study, not the Sierra Club, a World Bank study in the US found that $1 million invested in oil and gas in the US creates 5 jobs compared to 17 jobs per $1 million in clean energy. Energy saving building retrofits, 22 jobs per $1 million in mass transit, 13 jobs per $1 million invested in wind, 14 jobs per million invested in solar. Like the clean energy economy is far better economy per dollar spent for working people. And yet we have leadership in Congress and the party that doesn't even know how to make that argument. And part of why I think it's so important to have you elected, Jamal, is that like your fellow JD alum, Representative AOC, I think that's her official title, you understand that the green economy built from below, not the green economy downloaded from like greencapitalism.com, but the green economy built from below is the future of this country. And the green investment is fundamentally about empowering working people and Black and brown people to build their own future, a much better future. And the last thing I'll just say quickly on this, I was in New York after Hurricane Sandy, during Hurricane Sandy. It was horrible. I had to leave my apartment. It was in a flood zone. And one of the great environmental justice leaders in New York, Eddie Bautista, who's the head of the Environmental Justice Alliance, would say afterwards, he's like, we don't want to bounce back. We want to bounce forward. That's a very big difference. And I think that is what the conversation we need to be having is like, we're in a massive crisis. The underlying causes of that crisis are racism and economic inequality. We have to have a form of recovery that bounces us forward into a whole new economic model built up from below. And you're right. It's not the point of talking about this in granularity for me is not to prove to like some writer at Vox that we have like every PDF in the world. It's that this is not an abstraction, right? This is literally the plan to put people to work tomorrow, today, in like 5 hours. We're ready. We have the ideas and we have the research and we're ready to go. And I don't know, my take is that the leadership of the party needs a lot of new energy to really understand what it means to do progressive politics at this time in history.
Yeah, I totally agree with Daniel. And it's also the economic sense of green stimulus or green recovery is coming forward constantly. There was just a new study from Oxford where they surveyed 238 economists, folks who run central banks, folks who are finance ministers in countries, and by far the recovery policies that they thought were the best, both in terms of creating a full recovery and in creating sort of the green economies that they want, or the economies that they wanted, were green policies, right? Because like Daniel said, they're more job intensive. They have more, there's more bang for the buck, right? And also, just like if you do a lot of things now that aren't great, you can lock it in for the future. If you do a lot of things that are good, the effects also last into the future. So you're also making a down payment for sort of continued progress, productivity down the line. And it's just not a good look if even the Democratic bill is a bit behind conservative and progressive economists who are all like, today there was just a New York Times article about how there's a push among sort of economists of a wide swath to for the government to just pay to keep people on payrolls, like in an unlimited amount. Right now, what we have is capped. They only give a certain amount of money. It's created a mad rush, but they're like uncap it. I'm gonna get it wrong. It's either Denmark or Finland, where they're paying employers 80% of their payrolls, right? Just to keep people on board, no cap, just across the board. And those are the sorts of things that we need to be doing. We're making progress on paid leave, but we also have to be honest that the progress that these bills are making, we are 30 years behind the rest of the world. We're the only industrialized nation that didn't have paid leave before. So it's also, as much as they do represent very real gains in the US, we also have to stop being proud of being the tallest kid in kindergarten. It doesn't make any sense.
Jamal, are we the tallest kindergarten? I don't kidding.
I
We're supposed to be in like 5th grade. How are we still behind?
No, but that's a perfect analogy, and I think it captures everything that's wrong with the American economic system. It's like we beat our chests at how wealthy we are, but we have 8 million children living in poverty prior to the pandemic. We continue to invest disproportionately in our military. And we know studies have shown that when you invest in healthcare and education, that creates more jobs. It also creates more safety and security in our communities. And it creates a better overall life of fulfillment and well-being. And now we're having this fight with, it seems like, obviously corporations in the private sector, their goal is to privatize all of our public goods. They want to privatize water, public schools, etc. And it's like the Democrats, going back to your question, Wally, have brought into this idea that, the private sector will save us. And they've allowed themselves to be co-opted by the money and that way of thinking. And they don't realize, or we've forgotten that it's our government that has to secure and ensure the general welfare of all people, and investing in the green economy and healthcare and education and housing is what will create a better economy for all of us, which will then create a better economy for the entire country, not just, the 1/10 of 1%, not the select few, for everyone.
Yeah.
I think one thing I was going to say is, while we were making education and principle jokes, is that Daniel, while you do not think that the PDFs are that important, I will tell you that Principal Bowman does think the PDFs are important. would I'm sure enjoy being sent PDFs at some point about many of the things you've been talking about.
Please, yes. Like, I'm taking notes here as the two of you are speaking, so please share stuff. I'm a super wonky nerd when it comes to that stuff, but it's like when I first, and I don't want to go on a tangent, but when I learned about the impact of toxic stress and chronic trauma on the developing brain of a child, as an explanation to explain the achievement gap that we see in communities across the country. Like, that was like, that blew me away. And toxic stress and chronic trauma are policy created, right? Like bad policy creates toxic stress and chronic trauma, which leads to negative health, education, and economic outcomes. But our elected officials aren't making that connection. And that's why, like, I'm proud to be a middle school principal running for office to follow the science in a holistic way, so that we can create better policy for all of our communities.
Well, let me actually throw a question at you, Jamal, because I agree with that. And, look, I need a therapist, because all I do is make fun of PDFs on Zoom and then go and write PDFs. My job, and desperately try to get people to write about them at Vox.com. So there's like a, I don't know, there's like a Batman villain in there somewhere for like their 30th sequel. But the thing is, I guess it's not, the ideas aren't enough to win, right? Like, logic alone isn't enough to get things done in American politics. And my sense of why you're running is not just that you have a different idea of what government should do, but a different theory of change. Like, what does it actually mean to be a politician who helps to make, hard things happen? What does it mean to try to mobilize a base so that it's not just, trying to win a debate on MSNBC every now and then? Like, I'm curious to sort of hear from you, like, how do you build the mass political support? How do you differ from mainstream Democrats in actually the strategy to get things done?
Yeah, I heard AOC, Congresswoman AOC, say once that it's mass movements that transform American policy, not politicians. So to that point, and what I'm excited about is the kind of candidate that I am and the kind of campaign that we've been running has really gotten a lot of people excited in the district who weren't paying attention to things like Medicare for All and the Green New Deal and those issues. So it's about growing this mass movement, not just here in the district, but across the country. And the more people that are involved in our democracy, the more our democracy will become pure and secure, theoretically, whether it's mobilizing people here or mobilizing people in Kentucky to beat Mitch McConnell. It's about building a mass movement. So it's leveraging the congressional seat to do what's necessary at the congressional level in terms of policy and build the relationships there and move the needle there and scream from the mountaintops in that position. But it's also engaging communities who have felt marginalized and disenfranchised for their entire lives and making sure they're part of the political process. And it's new ideas, and it's a conversation, not just an education. And what I mean by that is not just us telling people what needs to happen and what they need to do. It's about meeting people where they are and listening very closely and engaging them in a transformative process. That's how I see it. And that's why I got into the race, because I saw, Ingle had about 9% of the district voting in the primary for him. And there's 91% of people not engaged in the process. And if we can engage that other 91%, now we're having different conversations and we're helping people to understand and believe and have faith and hope in something new and something possible. And this campaign from the very beginning has been about that faith and that hope.
I think that that's really, really amazing. And I know that people sort of talk bad about hope and change these days and, how it turned out. And I get that. But I also do think that restoring faith in government is a critical part of what we need to do to get progressive policy in particular, but just more generally to get people to understand, again, that government actually does have an incredibly unique, vital function. And I think this epidemic in a lot of ways showed that, right? That you actually can't put anyone on top of the federal government and it will run the same. I think for a bit, there was a sense that you just swap people out, doesn't matter. But the fact is there is no instrument like government, right? No company, whether it's a B Corp or whatnot, no company, all companies, their purpose is to derive profit in some sense. And they are definitely not directly accountable to the public. The government is the only body that is directly accountable to the public, that is committed in law and word and all the ways that's supposed to be committed to protecting the public and to acting on their behalf, right? And government has tools that no company, no matter how big they are, has. There's a reason that they spend all this money on lobbying. If they didn't need government, they keep it. Shareholders love a dollar, apparently. That's what I've learned. And so they're not spending it on accident. They're spending it because even behemoths like Amazon need the government on their side, because there are things that it can do that other bodies can't do. And I think it's just really important. It's not that we need to revere government, but I'm really excited about you running and folks like you running, because we aren't going to be able to trust government again until we see folks like you, right? Who we know are committed to people, who have clear articulations about why they're running and how they want to serve, and that really resonate and deeply understand what people are going through. Because even this is a time where like there's probably less faith in government than there might have been ever, but we also need the government maybe more than most of us ever have in our lifetimes. And so we've got to sort of square those two circles. Is that the right? I don't actually know that term, but I think that's it. But we have to sort of figure out a way to bridge that divide, because as long as people aren't engaged, we're not going to get the government that we need. And as long as we don't have the government we need, people won't get engaged because they're wondering what the purpose of it is.
One way you can support, there's about 200, 300 people watching this live stream right now. Say hi, everyone. But one way you can support and get involved in the fight is by going to bowmanforcongress.com. That's BOWMAN for congress.com. You can sign up to donate. You can sign up to volunteer. You can sign up for phone banking, or just sign up for emails, and we'll keep you updated throughout the campaign. But, you know, every donation counts. $5, $10, $100, whatever you can give right now. I know it's hard out there, but if you can just donate $3, that would go a long way into running this grassroots campaign. And Jamal, unlike his opponent, is not taking any donations from corporations, corporate PACs, fossil fuel companies, the military industrial complex, none of that. So all he can rely on is the support of ordinary people. But to turn toward the end of our conversation, one thing I wanted to ask all three of you about is that the people doing a lot of the heavy lifting in our economy right now are the workers doing essential services, predominantly people of color and women of color in the healthcare industry, in logistics and shipping and that kind of stuff, and government workers. And I was just wondering what the pandemic has exposed for you about that key part of the American economy, and what our policies we should be thinking about to address that. You know, those workers were precarious before this pandemic hit, and they will continue to be unless we really uplift them. And yeah, I know that Jamal, your mother was a postal worker, and there's been a huge attack on the Postal Service over the past few months. So that's a question for all three of you, anyone who wants to jump in.
Yeah, since you want to talk about my mother, I'll jump in first.
Well, doesn't need a therapist.
No, it's, you know, the other day we were doing some, you know, we were trying to capture some still shots and some video of me in the community, you know, with mask on, whatever. And the director asked me, do you know anyone in Co-op City you could call and just come downstairs? And I thought about it, and I was like, oh my God, everyone I knew in Co-op City had a pre-existing condition. So I didn't want to call them to come downstairs. And it just hit me like, wow, like people I've worked with, who I've known for years, have so many underlying conditions that they can't even leave the house. So that's one. Two, you know, my sister is a care worker. She provides care to seniors, you know, and she's taking care of my mom. So she's going to work, providing care there, and then coming home to my mom. She's making herself vulnerable. She's making my mom vulnerable. And again, initially didn't have the proper protection. My other sister works in a supermarket. She works in food distribution, and she's a cashier. And she was going to work without a mask very early on, and again was putting herself in harm's way every day. And you know, those are personal stories that have resonated throughout this entire district, which is why we've been banging the desk, banging the table for PPEs in the Defense Production Act by President Trump, which he never enacted. And well, he said he enacted it, he just didn't enact it with any sort of robust urgency to deal with the matter. So you're right, Waleed, this hits home on a personal level, not just in terms of Yonkers, but in terms of my family.
Yeah.
Anyone else want to jump in?
Yeah, I'll jump in. I think, and I think that this is what's coming across, and I hope that it is. I think that this pandemic, there's been a lot about how it's made us rethink what work is essential and what work isn't. But I think it's also shown that the ways that we value different types of work, just like we were talking about, there are no natural disasters, that doesn't happen naturally, right? And the ways that that has been shaped by race and class and gender, right? We know that occupations where women do more of the jobs are consistently paid at lower wages than jobs that are occupations that are majority men. And I hope that that's calling in question, like, why, in fact, do we pay care workers less? Is it actually objectively more difficult to be a CEO of a national corporation than a care worker or a teacher, right? Have you ever managed a class full of, well, you have, of 40 children, right? Is that actually more difficult than going to a lot of meetings, right? Or taking a lot of calls? And I think that it's just showing that the reason that we value CEOs so highly isn't necessarily because they do things that are so essential that if they stop doing them, we wouldn't be able to live. But that is the case with care workers, with the essential workers that we're seeing. And it has everything to do with race and class and who does those jobs, right? And somewhat about education. But again, these aren't natural distinctions. These are things that we can, and especially after this, should change. And so one policy, in addition to providing PPE, like Jamal mentioned, Principal Bowman, that's probably more appropriate, is hazard pay, which is in the new HEROES Act, right? So paying people additional, I think it's $13 on top of an hour on top of their current wage. But right now it's opt-in. So employers have to apply to get that money to provide hazard pay, which of course we know means that a bunch of people won't get hazard pay. And so again, a policy like that, good policy, poorly designed, but a policy where hazard pay is mandatory and is just being paid directly by the federal government or is mandated, right? So that employers have to apply if they're having essential workers and pay them. But making that mandated, I think, is actually a really crucial policy, and also could have a knock-on effect of essentially allowing a lot of people who never made enough to save, possibly, right, to create a nest egg, to take care of additional expenses, right? But actually giving them the chance to accumulate more money that potentially they could turn into wealth. It's actually, I think, a side effect of that that's really exciting.
Yeah. I think the only thing I would add quickly is, this is all exactly right. And it's amazing to see, for everybody to see, that it is workers and essential workers who make this whole thing possible. And we could talk about that a lot, but since we're kind of closing down, I think people are going to get mad, and people are going to be really mad. People are really, really hurting. And I think this just come back to Rihanna's point from earlier this evening. We need to channel that rage and that disgust with our system in a productive way, right? Towards positive change that will really change the system, because it could go in other directions too. And I think that is another thing that's so exciting, Jamal, about not just your platform, but also your theory of change, is it is about bringing people together. And it is about creating a new and stronger economy. And, to me, when I see, like, if all of this horrible crisis turns into a gigantic backlash against government, a gigantic backlash against elites, but without a positive alternative, then that would be a horrible waste of life. And so I don't know, I'm really excited that you have, I think, ideas, but also a theory of change and a kind of mentality, a sort of like political mentality that's about turning people's emotions and frustrations and anger at the system into actually making it so much better.
Oh, well, we're at time. So thank you, everyone, Rihanna, Daniel, Jamal, for joining and spending the evening with us. I learned a lot. I hope other people did. Again, there's about 200 or so folks on the call. So people can go to bowmanforcongress.com to sign up to donate, to volunteer, just sign up for updates. And if there's anything any of you three want to plug, we could potentially have another live stream just about Jamal's favorite comic books and superheroes. Batman was referenced. I know everyone has a busy month ahead. Does anyone have anything they want to plug for closing? Otherwise, we can end.
BowmanForCongress.com.
Yeah, nothing to plug other than Jamal.
And spelt out with letters because he's a principal. So it's none of that like four.
Yes.
Okay. Well, thanks everyone.
Thanks,
really
Rihanna. Thanks, Daniel.
Thank you.
Have a good evening.
Peace and love. Great to meet you both.
Bye.
Bye-bye.